Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Arnold Dreyblatt, an American media artist and composer, currently based in Berlin. The new album by Arnold Dreyblatt and the Orchestra of Excited Strings is called Resolve, and it's out now on Drag City. It's part of the continuum of Arnold's music. Arnold strings a double bass with piano wire and plays it in this very specific way, which produces this tone which is unmistakably Arnold's. It was great to hear the first few seconds of this new album and hear the echoes of something like Nodal Excitation from 1982. Arnold's been doing this for a while. He's also in his bio referenced as being part of the second generation of New York minimal composers, studied music with Pauline Oliveros, Lamont Young. He's very involved, has plenty of stories involving a lot of those individuals from that scene. But yeah, the current incarnation of the Orchestra of Excited Strings includes Arnold, Orhan Ambarchi, Conrad Sprenger, and Joachim Schutz. And it's a more jammed out, it feels like a groovier release than a lot of the stuff I've heard from the orchestra. They seem to really lean into the rhythm, kind of run very slack, which is great. You just hear them all rolling around these grooves. And of course, it's a beautiful sounding record when you've got headphones on. If you're playing it loud over speakers, the overtones and the various harmonic interminglings that get kicked off of the instruments is quite astounding. It was so lovely to speak to Arnold. We were a little shorter on time for this one, and Arnold just had buckets of stories and insights, so you don't really hear me talk much, which I like a lot. Hope you enjoy this one. I hope you're enjoying the podcast generally. If you want to donate to the show, just to help keep things ticking, you can do over at Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/crucial listening. You can donate monthly or just one-off, any amount you please. Thank you for listening as always. This is Arnold Dreyblatt on Crucial Listening. Hello, Arnold. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hello, Jack. Nice to be here.
Lovely to have you on. So we're here to talk about your 3 important albums that you've picked for this podcast. Before we get to those, I want to ask about your new album, Resolve, which is out on Drag City when this comes out. It's coming out when we're talking about it now, but will be out by then. So this is the first release from Arnold Dreyblatt and the Excited Strings since 2002, right? So over 20 years. So I'm guessing the Adding Machine was the one before this with this group, right?
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's also not exactly accurate. I mean, I'd have to think back. In 2012, I did a record with an indie band, Megaphone, and in a sense, we toured also a bit together. So that, one could consider that kind of an Orchestra of Excited Strings. And then there's been a lot of recordings coming out. So a lot of archival recordings, especially on Black Truffle, double record set, Choose, and then a number of other earlier recordings coming out from the 80s and 90s, which was great. So actually the band that is represented, or this version, because the Orchestra of Excited Strings is kind of I hate to say label in this context, but it's a it's a title that I've given to my ensemble since 1979. So, first in New York and other when in the States, and then when I came to Germany, and the ensemble, which was more or less represented on Resolve, was formed in 2009. We did record in 2012, but actually were unhappy with the recording. Shortly before the pandemic, a good friend, Oren Ambashi, who we had been working with for a long time, and as I said, so a lot of recordings on his label, joined the band, and we did some concerts, and then we decided to go into the studio, but the pandemic did kind of delay things a bit in all of our lives.
Yeah,
sure. So it's finally coming out. I mean, it was finished about a half a year ago, and it's been in the burners. Now waiting to come out. But okay, of course, the ensemble has been performing all that time, and I've been working also on other projects, musical projects, also at the same time. So it's not as if I've been inactive since 2011.
Yes,
yeah,
of course, yeah.
Right.
Really interesting to hear that you went into the studio to basically attempt this configuration quite a while back. I'm intrigued as to how this most recent session went in comparison. Like, how did you go back into the studio and, I don't know, ensure that things turned out different? I guess time had passed in the interim, but yeah, how was this session different to the first one?
Okay, first of all, it's the Orchestra of Excited Strings in its current incarnation contains two members who are both composers, performers, but also sound engineers or techies. So that probably has a lot to do with why the first record didn't come out, but or at least why we were not so sure about it. Yeah, I mean, it's actually a very lucky situation. We were invited to a wonderful space in Brussels called Atelier Klaus, which closed now, but is, I hear, opening again, which is a venue for concerts of experimental music, and with a great stage, and also a studio. And we had performed also elsewhere in Belgium, and came and did a concert, and then after the concert, we were in residence for a few days and did the recordings. I would say that my music is not so easy to record, or at least there's many different philosophies how to record. So I was very, very happy with Christoph, who recorded there, great sound engineer. It was great to perform live first and then do the recordings. He was very patient. We didn't finish. Then we went in again I think a year later, because of the pandemic, in Berlin to the Mouse on Mars studio. Mouse on Mars, I don't know, maybe some of the listeners know the group. Yeah. So they have a great studio also in Berlin, and we were happy to go in there. And then a long period of post-production because of my two sound engineers. And but I'm really, really very happy with the result.
It's so interesting to hear your sound. Obviously there are variations within your sound, but also your kind of more steadfast qualities of what you do be surrounded by different configurations of instruments. I'm familiar with Oren's work. He's been on this podcast before too. What is it about this configuration of players? And you've mentioned that you got two sound engineers there. That's a big plus.
Right.
What else makes them a pleasure to play with and make your music
well okay, I mean, they're not two sound engineers, they're two musicians and composers who are also sound engineers. And one, I think, very important in the group, we kind of started it together, and we worked together in the previous years in other configurations. Jörg Hiller, who goes under the stage name Conrad Sprenger, who was also working a lot with Oren, and a lot of other musicians. He's a solo artist. and has been performing extensively. We met, it's already 20 years ago, and I should say they're all younger. That's an interesting aspect. Right. So they're all a lot younger, and bring that into it. They all have their own music, which they've also, and musical practices, which they've brought into the ensemble. And individually, Conrad Sprenger, he developed a kind of automated guitar with solenoids that's controlled by computer, which is also part of the sound. He's also the percussionist. And as I say, we've been working together since maybe 2003. He brought in a guitarist, also a sound designer and musician from Hamburg, Joachim Schutz, who has been also working with a lot of different people to play actually a guitar that I designed, which has frets in this other tuning, which I work with. We can talk about that later. And a sustainer. Yeah, so I've been working with this guitar since early 90s. Has also very thin strings, just wire strings. I tend to like wires rather than overspun strings, and it has a very particular sound because of this, the sustainers and the thin strings, and of course playing in this other intonation. So he's learned to play in that. And then Oren, there's always been different roles. So in the ensemble, so I am producing a kind of rhythmic drone with strong overtones on my excited bass, and what I call my excited bass, which is not a bass, is actually in the violin range, also with piano wire on it and a particular way of playing. And at the same time, of course, it's the percussion that's driving it along. Also, Jörg Hiller, Conrad Sprenger is producing also some sine waves and this activated guitar at the same time, playing also rhythmically. And then on top of that, Joachim Schutz is playing, is selecting and going through actually chord progressions in, not in a traditional sense, but using different chord structures within the tuning system that I use. And on top of that, I've always had a sustaining instrument that has been with this ensemble. We worked for some years with Robin Hayward, who's a microtonal tuba player from the UK who lives in Berlin, very interesting musician, has his own ensemble. I worked with trombone. We had a hurdy-gurdy over many years in the ensemble dating back to my time in New York, different sustaining instruments. So there is Oren's role, so he, with his guitar set up and his little secret boxes on the table, he is producing this layers of fat, big harmonic content, which fits very well with the ensemble. So we had to kind of retune his guitar a little bit to fit in, but it was interesting. He just came in. Actually, we first played together in Japan. Right. Not all of us. That was myself. Again, Jörg Hiller, Conrad Sprenger, Oren Ambashi, and Jim O'Rourke. We did first kind of a little tour concert, and then we worked with other musicians in Tokyo. That was the beginning, and it just seemed to fit. Yeah, fitting is not only the instrument. I mean, that's a part of it, but fitting is like it's hard to say. What is it? The personality of the player, the approach to sound. I'm not looking at my ensemble for a master improviser who's going to show off his virtuosic talent. That's not what the music is about. The music is about producing a particular type of sound and fitting within the overall timbre. So and I think Oren understands that well. Yeah,
nice. The record is awesome. I've had such a good time with it. I'll include links in the show notes so that people can check it out as well.
Great.
And yeah, let's go to your important records, Arnold. So one question I like to ask at this point is about how you thought about the word important when picking your list. I mean, was there a way that you understood the word important in order to come up with the 3 records that you did?
Right, that's a very good question. So I had to kind of chew on that a bit. I think, it was first the question, are they records that are important to me now? Am I supposed to look for some obscure records or, I don't know, recordings that, I tend to be listening to now? Or are they records for me that are important historically? And maybe because of my generation, I'm not up on all the newest things. I mean, people recommend things to me. So I thought I would choose 3 recordings that have been important to me historically. And that was hard, because there's a lot of different composers I could have chosen, different music, especially in the earlier years. I mean, there's a lot of different music that influenced me, and I could have easily picked many times this number of 3, but I chose kind of 3 different directions.
Love it. Okay, great. So let's go for your first pick then, Arnold. So you could start by giving me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you too.
So the first record I selected is Tony Conrad with Faust, outside the Dream Syndicate, and specifically the one side called the Side of Man and Womankind. And there's a bit of a story connected to this from my own biography. Okay, many people know that I studied with Lamont Young. I was very much influenced by his work. And that was in the mid-'70s, I think 75, 76, even into the beginning of 77 when I studied with him. And I was also his tape librarian or tape archivist. During that time, I was working with his hundreds of tapes. And of course, one of the things about Lamont, we won't get into the whole politics of this, but Lamont is not an easy personality, and he was not very generous in the sense of allowing all of his music to be heard. And as I was listening, I mean, I had access to a lot of the recordings. I noted, I mean, of course, to say it again, the most important period I feel in Lamont's work, and the period which, in talking to those of the older generation, my peers in New York, the period that blew everybody's minds was the period in the mid-'60s, the Theater of Eternal Music with Tony Conrad, John Cale, and others in the group, later Terry Riley, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I should say I'm also a visual artist. I mean, all these years, not as a hobby, but I was teaching in an art school here in Germany many years, and I have a lot of my background is in experimental film and video, and I studied in Buffalo, where Tony Conrad later was teaching. He wasn't yet in the period I was there in 74. It was actually studying video arts with Woody and Stena Vasulka that brought me into thinking about sound. There was a fantastic sound or music department there with the composer Morton Feldman as the director. Our families knew each other. So, and Tony came to give a lecture there at that time about tuning, so which I remembered, and then I understood in looking at the history or this period in Lamont's work that Lamont composed with, he was very early working with sustained pitches, but those early compositions were written in Western notation. But this idea of tuning and the harmonic series and so forth with which he's associated actually, I believe, came through Tony, who was a mathematician and had been working with this earlier. I've written an article about this that was published in The Wire and now in a book. So that was really interesting to me. And but none of this material was released. I mean, there was, I don't know if you know this, that a kind of a bootleg Day of Niagara, which came out on Table of the Elements, which I gave to Jim O'Rourke, and Jim gave to Table of the Elements. We won't get into that, but in any case, which I had, one recording I copied, and I was curious. Of course, I couldn't look at all these tape binders and not listen, and but there was so little available, and it was always frustrating to me. And okay, then fast forward to, because now we're coming to this recording. I'm sorry, it was a long intro. more of an intro than the other records are going to get. And I'm not sure what year this was. Okay, this is it came out in 73. But or it was recorded in 73. I'm not sure actually when it came out on Table of the Elements, but a bit later, certainly later. I was visiting someone, actually Ernie Gusella, who's a video artist in New York, after I was no longer working with Lamont, and I was starting to begin doing my own music. And Ernie said, have you ever heard this? He knew that I started with Lamont, and he put on this record and this side, and it blew my mind, because I thought, wow, that's that sound, the sound of that ensemble that Tony was playing. I mean, this is also hard to talk about. It's a certain timbre, it's a certain kind of screechy violin, very high harmonics, digging in near the bridge, which was a sound that, was very important in my own music. And I immediately recognized it as that sound that I heard on Day of Niagara. Okay, at that time, it was a rare recording, actually, and actually, what it was actually, I think it was the LP. Yeah, it was re-released. It was the LP that I heard, and it must have been around 77, 78.
Right.
And that was very important to me. And of course, soon after, it took a few years till Tony, I mean, it was one moment of Tony performing with them and recording. Also the drum beats, I understood later from, there was also a concert at the Kitchen around that time with this kind of steady drum beat. So he had this idea of like taking frequency and slowing it down from the audio range and bringing it down, then becomes a drum beat. So extremely minimal, just this hitting of the drum and this incredibly complex drone sound, which has a kind of a folky character to it. And later then in early 90s, I was in somewhere in Europe, I think Tony came over, I did the sound for him, or I was on the mixer when he performed in Linz in Austria, I guess around 91, and he played it. It was the first time I really heard it live. And then of course it has a lot to do with the connection to Jim, and then Table of the Elements, and him starting to tour then. So basically what he did was, out of his own frustration that Lamont, his old friend, wouldn't give him copies of the tapes that he played on, he started playing it himself. Nice. I mean, that's the short version of it. It's a good lead-in to the next one, Sacred Guitar and Violin Music of the Modern Aztecs. So in that period, as I began also my music, I listened to a lot of non-Western music. I mean, of course, in addition to, I was in New York going to concerts. It was a very exciting time, the 70s, mid-70s, late 70s, early 80s. very, very fruitful period in all the arts, and especially in music. It was also a very small world, like a lot of names which are now quite well known were, it was a small community. And and I also listened to a lot of, folk music, non-Western music. This record is now on Smithsonian Folkways because the Smithsonian Institute, the Museum and Research Institute in Washington, bought the catalog. But this Folkways was, I think, founded by Moses Ash, and it was an incredible label. I mean, also in the early days, this is why, like I asked you your age, so one has to be transported back to a time where, there was no internet. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. How are we going to get information? How do you know even what's happening, what's interesting? So there used to be like record stores and certain record stores, and I've heard this story from others. Even if you were born in Ohio or some small town in England, there'd be some place you would go in some larger town or city, and there would be one record store that had kind of weirder stuff, and there would be somebody there you could talk to, and say, what's this? You'd look through the stacks, and they'd say, well, you might also be interested in this. And there were some radio programs. I don't know how it was in the UK, but there was in New York Public Radio, WBAI, and there would be certain shows that would play interesting music, or college stations, but it was very limited. And I found this record in the Lincoln Center Music Library, which is also where I discovered Meredith Monk and a number of other people very early on. I was very young. I was maybe 20. Let's see, in 75 I was 22. So this time we're talking about, I was like 21, 22, 23, and I found this record there in the library. I took it out, and then I think I actually made a reel-to-reel copy of it, but then eventually I bought it. These Folkways records were really heavy. I mean, and they had these great, physically heavy, and they had these great covers. So the covers, because they had a style with paper over, kind of laminated over a kind of, I don't know what the technical term for it was, but it was very unusual. And they had things from, such as sacred music, violin music of the modern Aztecs. But you could find experimental music. They had some John Cage. They had what we would call today music, recording in the landscape. What do we call that again?
Field recording?
Field recordings, which is funny to me because field recordings actually comes from anthropology. Yeah. When they would go and make this is actually a real field recording. Yeah. In its original term. Yeah. Use of the term. So, I think that's also it's also interesting to think back, what it meant to find a record like this, and then when I think what interested me about it. Okay, first of all, just to say, it's maybe the title's a bit misleading. Okay, it is sacred music. It's ritual music. It's the people that play it. It's the Nahu or Nahua, I don't know how you pronounce it, people who are the descendants of the Aztecs. Yeah, and their language is a modern version of the Aztec language. So obviously it was changed, probably has Spanish in it and so forth. But it's great. On the record, it says things like, one says Aztec violinists, guitarists, ritual specialists, young girls, and then one old woman.
Right.
This is great. And then another one, it says ritual specialists, young girls and dancers, male dancers with rattles. Yeah. So I think what fascinated about it is the string sound, which is, of course, somehow related to the sound of my music, also in my earliest recordings. The first record, Nodal Excitation, because this is what I was listening to at the time. They're homemade violin. There's homemade violins and guitars. They're not bought. Yeah, you can see it on the cover what they're playing, and yeah, it also connects to Tony Conrad. This violin sound. Not the sort of refined, or I hate to use the word refined, but at least the accepted contemporary classical violin timbre with heavy vibrato, but just the raw playing on the strings and getting the sound out. And of course, folk music also. I'm also a great fan of things like Cajun music. Yeah. So there's something, the music, it kind of turns into it's dance music, yeah, for a movement, but it's also music that has something circular in it. And the melody comes again and again. I never forget, I was once at a concert in New York, and of Cajun music. It was actually an African-American Cajun band, and playing the first time in front of, basically a white audience in New York. This is in the 70s. And one tune, everybody clapped very loud. And then the leader was the Ardoin brothers, a family. And
right.
The leader, the oldest man, he just said, "Oh, you liked it, huh? Okay, we'll play it again." I thought that was great. You'd never do that in a normal concert. Yeah.
That's fabulous.
So yeah, I think of course, in terms of minimalism, minimalism can be interpreted in different ways, but we say like reduced forms, reduced structures, repetition, and so forth. Of course, we find that in folk music and a lot of non-Western music, and also classical music like gagaku, Japanese gagaku, and Middle Eastern music. I mean, Lamont, of course, studied Indian music. Okay, we won't get into that, but there is a connection, yeah, and I think so. In terms of the instrumentation, I somehow recognize this is something which spoke to me at the time and related to other things I was doing.
Arnold, let's go to your final important record in that case. So, yeah, give me the name of the record and the artist and a little bit about why it's important to you too.
Okay. The third record is Automatic Writing from Robert Ashley, 1979, issued on Lovely Music, his own record label with Mimi Johnson. Yeah, this is something a little bit different. Again, I could have chosen so many other things, but I thought to go in another direction, which maybe relates a little bit more to my other work in the arts, and to some degree, or at least both to music and to some of my other practices. What's interesting is, okay, it's 1979. I heard it. I don't think I had it back then. I don't know. I got it some years later. I have to say that even though, I was in the scene, in fact, I studied at Wesleyan with Alvin Lucier when also de Marinis was Paul de Marinis was teaching there, so I knew him. He also worked on this record designing the electronic circuits as a composer also. Of course, through Alvin and him, I mean, I was in these circles with the Lovely Music people. I don't know how else. There's a whole scene. There was a whole scene. Which not only okay, Bob died recently, but a lot of those people, some of them are known, some of them not so well known, from Peter Gordon, Jill Crozen, Blue Jean Tyranny, et cetera, et cetera. I think at the time I was very much, I was a bit of a stringent minimalist, and I was really into sound. And for me at the time, I felt that Bob Ashley was a bit poppy. Yeah. And
Right.
it's interesting to say that, so, and in fact, I was very close friends with Phil Niblock back then. I could have chosen his music, but I chose Tony instead. Old friend. I remember that Phil then was a little skeptical about that whole lovely music scene. Yeah. And even Alvin was at, they, Private Parts, they came up and did the whole thing in Wesleyan when I was there. And even though they're very old friends, he was like, they're acting like the Rolling Stones, I remember Alvin said. But later, I started to be interested in Ashley gradually. My other work is very much text-oriented. That's one thing. And I also work with themes related to memory. And it turned out that actually... I started to understand that Ashley was also interested in this area, and they also was working with text. And this piece, Automatic Writing, it's considered a very early ambient work. I mean, of course, the term ambient didn't exist at the time. The text is barely understandable. It's almost subliminal. I would call it subliminal. I think Ashley wrote about it that he was interested in involuntary speech. Yeah. And I can maybe make a connection because, in fact, more recently I worked for a number of years and did an installation with sound and image related. It's called the resting state, which is a state of the brain when we have no input. Yeah, when we're kind of daydreaming and things come up from the past and we're in a waiting room, and then we start thinking, well, next week I'm supposed to meet this guy, and we'll probably talk about this or that. And I did a work about that with his speech, which also includes sound. I mean, there's also a record that I'm working on now that's going to come out with some of this material. And so it is it's been an interest of mine for many years. There's something about this record because, you listen. You can't quite get what it's about. I mean, the content is kind of drifting. And when I use these terms like subliminal, non-voluntary, or it's also, you kind of can't quite put your finger on what's happening. I mean, there's some tones coming in and out, but we drift along with it. So it's another type of minimalism. Yeah. So in a sense, but also involving text and maybe involving a mental state. That we are often in, but don't really look at, don't really examine. So, I mean, there are many other pieces of his that I like very much, but I think this is something very special. And yeah, it's kind of it's a classic recording and very unusual. So there's maybe two interesting aspects. One is that as a lesson to all the younger public out there, what you don't like now, you might like later on. You may rediscover it. Yeah. Yeah. You may listen to something that you really loved when you were younger and listen to it 15 years later and think, oh God, what did I ever find interesting in this? Or maybe the other way that, I've also seen in myself that I revisit certain preoccupations I had earlier in music. I abandon interests and then come back to them, or even suddenly discover some type of, in the terms of Bob, I have great respect for his work, but I mean, also some of his later work. For instance, he did I forget which title it is now, but he created a work where the text is about getting older. A beautiful text, but and also it took me a while to understand that his music is in a way functioning with the text in a certain relationship, which is hard to define, although it's quite, when I've looked at, I got to know Sam Ashley, his son, and we worked together once in Vienna. And I understood then how it's scored out, how the text, this is something he developed later after Automatic Writing, where he had a certain kind of notation for the rhythm of the text. Not exactly what you would find in a typical Western score, but a kind of, of finding a tempo. And there were also drawings of this. And there were certain speakers who he worked with who could do that. Sam was one of them. Unfortunately, he passed away also. But it's interesting. A composer from this time who really looked at not only speech as a sound, but also looking at how people. He often listened to conversations, random conversations, what he would hear in the street or where he was, and also from his. I think he grew up in the Midwest, from the world that he grew up with, and then incorporating that into his work. So, and then he, of course, pioneered. In collaboration with other musicians, certain techniques with electronics, and also, this kind of drifting in and out of almost, how can I say it? Maybe music which seems to have no particular attention. Sometimes I feel like in his work, it's almost like sitting in some Holiday Inn restaurant, a bar late at night, and there's some guy playing some cocktail piano, and then people are talking around you. It has this kind of atmosphere, some of the works. And I think that's where he got it. Also. It's another way of thinking about intention than in the sense of John Cage, indeterminacy.
Arnold, I have one more question for you, which relates to something you said earlier, actually, about how obviously accessing music and purchasing music was a very different process back in, say, your teens and early 20s. How do you tend to bring music into your life now? Like, how are you discovering music? What formats are you buying it in? Tell me what that looks like.
That's an interesting question. So I have to think out loud now a bit. I find it more difficult now because everything is available. Yeah. And of course that has an incredible advantage. That I can go to Spotify or whatever. If I don't find it here, I'll find it somewhere else. I'll find someone illegally putting it on YouTube or whatever. So the access is there. But of course, there's something, and that's really hard to talk about. You tend to sound like an old fogey if I would say that there was a value to finding something,
totally,
and the time it took to get to it, and the value, you feel like you're holding something valuable that maybe not everyone knows about, and that's kind of lost now. I know this because I was teaching for many years, and just thinking of my students, I talked to them about that a lot because they didn't understand that. So it's the same in the arts, in all the arts. And especially, in what for lack of a better term, the avant-garde, so the non-mainstream kinds of music. So everything is available. It also, it's had positive effects. So for instance, when I started out with tuning, working in alternative tunings, nobody knew what I was talking about. It was such a niche area that the people who were really into it were really a little bit weird. So it was really in the corner somewhere. And now all the kids, they're all working with tuning systems because the technology is available and you can hear it. So it's become, at least in a lot of the young musicians I know, kind of part of the toolkit. That's really interesting. But about how I get access to music. Okay, there's also something that happens when you maybe get to a certain age, so I don't need to hear every single thing that's come out anymore. And so I do depend on asking, younger people what they're listening to, and that they recommend music to me, rather than letting Spotify do it. I would, just what are you listening to? And there, I mean, because so much is available, and in a younger generation, it can be a very wide range of things. So, I tend to ask people around me, and especially younger people, of course, I do also, look online. As everyone else, people give me. A lot of musicians give me their records, so there's a library, et cetera, et cetera. And I read I might look at The Wire. I might look for recommendations from certain journalists, that I respect. So that I think it's a very wide area, but I tend to not. Okay, when I was younger, I used to have music going all the time. When I think of me in my 20s, even early 30s, and I tend to want to, I have more of a problem having that background music on. I tend to want to listen to something, intentionally. So,
yes.
And I think that's changed. So, I'm going to be 70. So maybe also I don't mind having no sound. Sometimes, the world is pretty noisy.
Right. Yeah.
So, that's maybe a difference. And any other questions?
No, Arnold, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk through. I mean, firstly, your new record, which I repeat is wonderful, and then these 3 records as well, which I've had loads of fun with. It's great to hear them all interconnected as well. Obviously, you get the sense that there's a through line simply because someone is putting them all together. So it's lovely to hear them as a coherent set. So thank you so much for your time on this.
Okay, thank you. Take care.